Hello, everyone. I'm Tess from Napa County Library. It is spooky season, and that means it's time for more bone-chilling tales of Napa history. We have local historian and Napa Valley Register columnist Rebecca Yerger here with us for her 13th annual Spooky Napa presentation. So without further ado, let's go back in time for some local scary stories.
Well, thank you, Tess. I am going to pause for a moment and bring up my PowerPoint. And let's see if I can get this going here. There we go. And I'm going to minimize myself here, so you'll only be hearing my voice. There we go. All right. I'm going to go back here. Well, as I said, welcome to the 13th annual Spooky Napa. And thank you, Tess, for this opportunity, and to the Napa County Library System for allowing me to do this for the 13th time. I think everyone, for the most part, enjoys it. Who doesn't enjoy a good ghost story? Anyway, I also want to thank Napa County Landmarks and NCL President Ernie Schlobohm for allowing me to use this office and their Zoom connection to make this presentation possible. And also, without Annie Schaefer's help, I probably wouldn't have some of the great images that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening or today. The first story I'm going to tell you about, because we need to get right to these scary people, because they might not like being held hostage, kept waiting. Anyway, I want to talk about ghostly women in white. And the first one is the woman at the Waterworks. Now, the Napa Waterworks, it was Napa City Waterworks, was once located about where Hagen Road and Silverado Trail, the part that's in town, connect. It's that hill that's right above that intersection. And it was a small reservoir, and it was a water reservoir, but they allowed swimming and activities there. And there has been seen on numerous occasions a ghostly woman in white. She was walking along the old stone wall, which was the, as I said, the dam for the reservoir. This apparition is full human form, as I said, a woman. Her hair is in what you might call an updo. It's appropriate hairstyle for what seems to be the early 1900s, as is her clothing. She wears a long white dress, and it's detailed as it would be if it was made in the or worn in the early 1900s. She's seen pacing and her hands cupped around her mouth as if she's calling to someone. And people, when they first see her, think that she's real until they can't hear her voice. And she's not that far away, so you would think it would carry. And she appears to be calling out to someone. She also appears to be becoming increasingly anxious and faster pacing. At the same time, as she becomes more anxious, she starts to become more transparent. Then all of a sudden, she seems to be startled, and she whirls around as if someone has come up behind her. Then suddenly, her hands go over her face, her head drops, she crumbles to the ground and disappears. As a historical side note, there were drownings at the Waterworks, and she may have, and it seems to be that she received some bad news, like the person she was calling out to, possibly a child, had met with tragedy or was in some type of peril. So that is the first story, and that's the woman in white at the Napa City Waterworks. The next one is about Lucina Greenwood. And I'm going to give you a little historical background on her story, in that she was tragically involved in a horrible murder, almost an attempted double murder, as well as a home invasion. Now, she was, this took place in 1891, and she was murdered. She was a victim of Billy Rowe, and he was later found out to be a serial killer, a sociopath, actually. He had an accomplice by the last name of Schmidt, and the two originally planned to just do a home invasion or commit home invasion at the Greenwood house. Now, the Greenwood house was located at what would be the southeast corner of the highway and Jameson Canyon, and on the opposite side, the west side, is what is now the airport and the Airport Boulevard, I do believe. Anyway, these two men came into the house, and Lucina's husband, Captain John Greenwood, was home alone in the house, and they tied him up in the kitchen and were trying to coerce out of him where all their family heirlooms were, all their riches were being kept. The house was still under construction, so a lot of those items, those objects, were held elsewhere and were not in place at the house. So here in the kitchen, you see these two men with the captain tied and being physically assaulted. And this is what Lucina walked into when she came into the kitchen. She had just returned home from visiting a friend further down the Jameson Canyon Road. Anyway, she turned around to go out the door and get back in her wagon to go get help. Well, Roe was not going to have that happen. He wrestled with Lucina. She put up a good fight. They both fell through the railing of the back porch onto the ground below. And at that point, Roe dragged her back into the house, through the kitchen, and into the adjoining dining room, which served as their bedroom for the time being while the house was being finished. And there, he murdered Lucina. Some say she was strangled, but based on Captain Greenwood's testimony and the trial to come, she was making gurgling noises, and it seemed that maybe she was poisoned. Only a forensic person would be able to answer that question. It's just a guess on my part based on past testimony. But anyway, at one point, they dragged the captain from the kitchen into the hallway, still assaulting him and trying to force him to show them where all the valuable objects were. And he refused, or actually said there wasn't anything in the house. He was being honest. And as I said, he went by where Lucina was laying and dying. They laid the captain down on the floor of the hallway by the front door and shot him in the head twice. Roe and Schmidt left the house, went to what was called the Saw School House at the time, which is a bar and hotel. What is now, was once Villa Romano, and it's now another restaurant, to give you an idea that the building still exists and where it was located. The two men decided that they were going to come back to the Greenwood house and case the place again to make sure that they hadn't missed anything. But when they came back, much to their surprise and to the anger of Roe, the captain had survived the gunshot wounds to his head. And they also found Greenwood next to his wife, Lucina, who had passed from whatever affliction Roe had put upon her. Anyway, Roe was so furious that he shot the captain again. And at that point, Roe and Schmidt went out of the house and they went their separate ways. Eventually, Schmidt ended up in Denver, Colorado. And he turned himself in to the sheriff in Denver because he was just so overwhelmed by the guilt of what had happened, because it was not part of what he agreed to, which was murder. So Schmidt was brought back to Napa, tried, convicted, sent to San Quentin as an accomplice. And there in San Quentin, he died on what was called Crank's Alley. And Crank's Alley was where the prisoners who had gone insane, that's where they were incarcerated. And that's where he died. Returning to the Greenwood house and the captain on the day after the home invasion, he managed, with 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to his head, to drag himself from his house to his front gate, where by daybreak, his neighbor, John Kelly, as in Kelly Road, was driving by and saw the captain, came to the captain's aid, And when he heard of what happened, informed the sheriff and also sought and gained medical attention for the captain. A posse was called and they went out looking for the two men. And so much time had transpired or passed that they were unable to find him. Now we're going to fast forward a number of years to about 1895. And Greenwood, he was recovering from his wounds, but at the same time, Roe was in Southern California. He was living in a boarding house. And one night he decided to go to a local bar that was right across the street. And after having too many drinks, he started bragging to the bartender of what he had done, had literally gotten away with murder in Napa County. And then Roe staggered back to his room. The bartender, who happened to be an off-duty U.S. Marshal, telegrammed the Napa County Sheriff and said, "Did this happen?" The sheriff here said, "Yes, definitely hold the man. We will come and get him." And that's exactly what happened. Roe was brought back to Napa. He was tried and convicted of first-degree murder, and he was executed on January 15th, 1895. And he was the last person legally publicly executed in the state of California. It was such a big deal that it was by invitation only. And as a side note, the County of Napa Sheriff's Department has the gallows, the hood, the restraints, the noose, and photographs of the actual execution, which was, as I said, by hanging. Anyway, regarding the haunting or appearances, visitation, Lucina, she was always with the house. And people who resided in the house would say that she would come upstairs at night and just check in to make sure everyone was okay. And once she knew everyone was tucked into bed, she would leave the rooms and disappear. But once the house was moved, which it was to make way for the doctor's company office building, and moved across the way to Airport Boulevard, she stayed with the property. And she has been seen walking through the doctor's company building around the grounds, and also supposedly at 5:15 every evening, there's a computer glitch, which they attribute to her, because that was about the time that she was murdered by Billy Rowe. So those are the two sightings of Lucina Greenwood and a ghostly woman in white. The next story has to do with a Canaris area and Napa Valley College area sighting. And it is of a mystical shaman. And it's primarily in the wetlands area and during a full moon. It is a full human form that's dense. You can't see through it. As for gender, it can't be told because it's wearing an iridescent, long, hooded robe. And so you really can't see the face because its back is to you. And also you can't tell by form whether it's male or female, as I said. It stands at the water's edge, standing, and then kneels down on one knee. It reaches down into the waters and scoops up something from the water. Then it rises up, extends its arms forward and upward, and its hands are still closed and cupped. Then, with its arms fully extended and looking upward, it opens its hands and releases moths or some type of flying insect that's glowing white and iridescent and transparent. It then bows its head as if to say prayer. Then it moves to its next location, which is further away from the observer. It repeats the same moves or motions until it's out of view. But with each movement further away, it also becomes increasingly transparent until it fades away and out of view. As far as Napa Valley College, some staff there have said that they've seen this particular figure standing up on a slight mound that's on the campus. And when someone comes up to this particular being and says, "Can I help you?" it turns and looks at the human. It's a pleasant, non-threatening feeling, but it has no features. And as it turns and looks and gives this warm and gentle vibe, if you will, it vanishes out of sight. So that is the mystical shaman story. The next one is a longer story. It's the conniving old crone. Now, this is obviously an animated or cartoon type of image. It is not the house that I'll be speaking about. This takes place in the Old Sonoma Road area. It's in town portion of Old Sonoma Road near the middle school. It's the former earthly home of an older woman of advanced years. She was very particular in life about outward appearance of both her home and herself. She never left the house in anything but her finest clothing and all decked out with makeup and jewelry. She was very social. She loved being around people and having her family around her. And she loved doing things for people. But there were many strings attached to those kindnesses. In fact, they were like strings of a cobweb that would entrap a person. This person also had numerous health issues. She also was diagnosed with OCD, that's obsessive compulsive disorder, and in combination, they resulted in her death. Now, as far as the haunting, the house was sold following her death as per her wishes. Then there was a succession of buyers, and they bought the house saying this is a great beginning house, starter house, and they talked about how they wanted to make it their own home. They was just so thrilled with it. But not long after they had purchased the house, they turned around and quickly sold it. And then it became more and more difficult to sell the house. You know, people went in enthusiastic and then couldn't get out of the house fast enough. Well, the realtors were becoming rather concerned and curious about what was happening because the house was supposed to, the proceeds of the sale of the house were to go to a local nonprofit. And it was their responsibility to make sure it was a successful sale. So they started talking about what was going on with the previous buyers and also a few people who had gone through in anticipation of buying the house. As I said, the new owners, as per usual, wanted to make it their own home. They wanted to make a few updates and upgrades, you know, like the electrical, so that way it was compatible with today's living. And also they wanted on occasion to turn rooms into different uses. Let's say like the dining room into the office or some such thing. And at first, what was going on, the unsettling occurrences were rather subtle. They'd be missing tools. And then when furniture was rearranged to facilitate that change of use, the people would be, you know, happy with what they did, go to bed that night. They wouldn't hear a thing and then come down the next morning and find that the furniture had been moved back into their right location. The dining room is the dining room, and the office furniture sometimes is outside. Anyway, as things escalated, you know, one couple had gone through and upgraded all the electrical in the kitchen, and the crone appeared for the first time, and she was not anywhere desirable to look upon. She was not as lovely to look upon as she was in life. Anyway, she reached out and touched the wiring, blew out the circuitry, and caused a fire. And then as far as when it was up for sale, the crone would appear in things like the mirrors and glass surfaces, and then she'd reach out and touch people with her icy hands. And as I said, she was not pleasant to look upon. Desperate, the realtors called, you might say, a specialist or two in the spiritual world. They came to the house and they found no reasoning with this former woman, the old crone. And they found her to be a very mean spirit but she would not let go either of the house and her former life. So what they did is they went room by room from top to bottom and looked for anything that might have been left behind that was hers. Then they did a physical cleaning, scrubbing down the walls and the floors, everything, to remove any possible residue from her life. And then they did a clearing, as like the saging and that sort of thing. And it took a long time to finally get her out of the house. She became weaker and weaker as they did more and more of this, but she was still very mean-spirited. But finally, with the last clearing and sage and chants and everything else, she finally vanished. And once they were sure that she was gone, the house went back on the market and was sold quickly. And it is a home and continues to be the home of those particular buyers. Now, this is the next story that takes place at Tulaque Cemetery. It would be during the day because the cemetery is only open during the daylight hours. Anyway, at this cemetery, and for the eternal fan, it is a white male, early 20s. He is dense in form, and he's a full human form. So it's like from head to toe. He's dressed in 1950s attire, just like James Dean. Blue jeans, white t-shirt with its sleeves rolled up, and one sleeve conceals a cigarette pack, as did James Dean. He also wears dark glasses that are pulled down or set lower on the bridge of his nose, so you can see his eyes, looking over the top of his sunglasses. The other stands near or leans up against the wall of the niche and crypt area. Those are outside buildings, exterior buildings that are built on top of some of the rocky outcrops of Tulaque Cemetery. Anyway, he starts talking to the mortals, as I call them, like you and I, about James Dean and what a great actor he was and his wonderful movies. But when the eternal fan starts to talk about Dean's tragic death, the mortals realize the fan is not of the living. And when he starts to become more transparent in the process. But when the fan soon realizes his truth has been revealed, he then pushes up his dark glasses, snaps both of his right and left fingers, points at the stunned mortal, laughs and says, "Ha ha ha, gotcha. See, I'm just as much of a bad boy as my best bud, James Dean," and vanishes. As I said, this happens during the day. Okay, here comes another story that takes place in the Mount Veeder, La Jolla Road area of West Napa. That's the setting, and the setting's also along the twists and turns of that Western Hill area. And that area also has a unique attribute in that it has Spanish moss. And when it hangs down from the trees and the headlights hit that Spanish moss, it gives kind of a creepy, ghostly feeling and appearance. Now, this particular story is called As the Crow Flies. The crows are typically seen and heard during the daylight hours or daytime. They're very social animals. They live together in groups. And by the way, a group of crows is called a murder of crows. And, we all know how noisy they are. And they also have occasional solo crows for their group that are considered sentries, that keep an eye out for predators and trouble. Anyway, along this dangerous stretch of road, a solo crow, and it's spotted day and night, 24/7, doesn't seem to associate with any other crows that are around, and typically makes no sounds. But as vehicles approach, especially in the evening, it flies alongside, and there's something odd about it. But also, it's able to keep up with the vehicle, regardless of how fast that vehicle is driving or going. And then suddenly it will veer off, and it vanishes. But much to the driver's terror, it looks up moments later to see the crow heading towards the windshield at full speed. And to make it even more uncomfortable, its eyes are glowing red. It has a hauntingly eerie or otherworld cry. And its wingspans are now long enough to cover the entire windshield. And it's flying at excessive speed towards that vehicle. And naturally, drivers would swerve away to avoid a collision with such an unearthly creature. And then they would slam on their brakes and bring themselves to a stop. The crow flies off at that point, crying its eerie cry. The drivers then discover, once they look around, that it was a bad stretch of road. And if they had continued on the road as they were driving, they would have gone off the cliff and would surely have been seriously injured, if not killed. So that crow, although a fright to see and hear, saved their lives. So that is the story As the Crow Flies. And we're going to go on to our next story, which is also in the Western Hills. It is a well-known story. It's actually a legend. It's Rebobs and More. Anyway, this takes place at the very end of Partridge Road, which is kind of in the Browns Valley area. And it's a very isolated road with minimal lights, and it's kind of creepy, actually. And back in the day when this story started, it was even more isolated and even creepier. It used to be a lover's rendezvous, and some speculate the story came about from either parents or whatever to discourage young couples from going up there for obvious reasons. The origin of this story is unknown, but it seemed to become popular starting in the 50s, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there are also various versions now as to what the Rebobs really are. And there are also many theories as to how they came to be here. But I will go on to describe the description I heard in earlier days as to what Rebobs look like. They're half gorilla or ape and half human. They have long claws and fangs. They are extremely strong. They have large wings on their back. So think of the Wizard of Oz and the flying monkeys, but on steroids. They seem to crave the flesh and blood of passion-filled young lovers. They attack the couples when they are blissfully ignorant. They descend quickly upon the car, rip it open like a tin can, and devour the couple. The next day, stories of the young couple's demise spread throughout the campus like wildfire. Did you hear about Bobby and Susie? Oh, they were up at Partridge Point, and they were devoured by the Rebobs, and on and on and on. And so those that were foolhardy and foolish, or were provoked, if you will, into going up there, dared to go up there, would go up to, Partridge Point, to the lair of the Rebobs. So anyway, it usually was a setup for some naive younger classmates. And some of the group that knew all about this would go up in advance, and they'd have gorilla masks and the cultivating tool that looks like a claw that you use in the yard. And they'd hide their vehicle, and then they would wait for the car with the victim, if you will. And once it was parked in a specific spot, they would start shaking the shrubbery, and they would start making noises. And inside the car, the people were building up the story. And then all of a sudden, they would jump out of the shrubbery and having the masks on and the claw, and they would just freak out the poor victim, the naive individuals in the back of the car. And there have been a number of personal accidents. People have passed out, among other things. Some went tearing down the road because they were so frightened. And sometimes when they came up in their own car, they would tear down the street or the road. And there have been many axles broken in that process. So anyway, it was obviously a setup, something that a lot of people could not live down for a long time. And that is the legend, in short, of the Rebobs. But there's also other ghostly and unexplained paranormal activity in that area. It's the old cemetery. And I call it the cemetery and the creepy caretaker. Some have said they've gone up there to see, check out, are there Rebobs up there? And in the process, they go through the cemetery. By the way, it's now fenced in because it's part of private property. So I would discourage you from going there because it would be trespassing. Anyway, above some of these, the graves, and it's primarily the Partridge family, it's a private cemetery. There's like a strange fog that drifts over it. There's also the old caretaker's shack or cottage. And there's a real weird greenish glow emanating from the windows. And so they're kind of walking around, kind of creeped out. And they notice that all of a sudden there's this person, this strange looking man who's very thin and gaunt and ghostly looking and long gray hair. And he has a shotgun and he's running towards them. So they decide it's wise to get out of there. So they try to start running, but the ground beneath them starts to sink as if it's swallowing up their feet. So they're not making much progress. And as the caretaker gets closer to them, he raises his shotgun, and most of them, the humans, do manage to make it out. They turn back to look. The caretaker vanishes before their very eyes, and that greenish glow vanishes from within the cottage. So that is the story of the creepy caretaker and the Rebobs at Partridge Road, where the lovers rendezvous. So we'll go on to the next story, which is the deceitful diplomat. Okay, the setting is the veterans home. He lived there in life, and he resides there after life. The background about this particular being: he was a male in his 30s to early 40s. He was a bit rotund, but still handsome. Had a beard and very mesmerizing eyes. Extremely intelligent, and he knew it, and he flaunted it. He made a lot of promises to people, which he didn't always keep. He read people very well, and he could figure out who they were and what they wanted and their weaknesses, that sort of thing, and their strengths. He was quite the smooth talker, and he was quite the puffery of himself and his talents. He wanted to be the best and to belittle everyone else. He lived a life of excess: food, wine, partners of both genders, lavish gifts to a selected few of his inner circle as a way to show his attention to them and his affection for them, as well as to gain their debt. The incident that brought about the haunting: he made and broke promises to the wrong person, which caused a big financial problem for that individual and resulted in a legal mess. The diplomat have hardly apologized, but said it wasn't his fault. It was this other person's fault, which infuriated his victim. A few years later, his victim, now penniless and out of prison, called in favors for revenge and to ruin the deceitful diplomat. A special party, and this all occurred during the Prohibition era, a special party for the deceitful diplomat with every possible excess: food, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, which were very popular in Prohibition, especially morphine and all the other stuff. The beautiful people, the people he always wanted to be around. And he was made to be sure he knew he was the center of attention at that party. But part of this whole thing, there was a setup raid. Most of the people that were there, the beautiful people, had left before that time, before the raid. But the diplomat was in a state of disgrace, you might say, when the raid happened. He was arrested and he was put in a jail cell to dry out. He went before the judge and he didn't have much money, so he couldn't make bail. He was put back in jail. And one of his friends from that party said, "Here, I have something for you that will, help you relax and get over this," because the diplomat was very upset. And so he imbibed. The next day, he was found dead in his cell from an overdose. As far as the haunting is concerned, is a transparent, full-form World War I diplomatic corps uniform. That's the way he's seen. He's seen strolling around the veteran home grounds, especially the Armistice Chapel, the Lincoln Theater, and the cemetery. He speaks many languages. As a diplomat, he had to know a number of languages, from French to Italian to Latin to English to Spanish, and many others, probably Russian too. Anyway, as he's speaking his languages, various languages to the humans that are passing by, he's very gallant. He's quite the player, or playa, as they say now. He tries to be helpful, such as giving directions, that sort of thing. And when he's at the cemetery, he sees humans that are paying tribute to someone who's at rest there. He tries to provide comforting words. But the minute he starts to make a promise to any of these people, he disappears. And he has the most agonizing expression on his face when he's vanished, as if he is experiencing karmic justice. So that is the story of the deceitful diplomat. Now we're going to go on to the awkward attendant. The setting is a day spa in the Yountville area. It's a human-like form, including, you can actually see her features, a young woman who's in her 20s or thereabouts, and she's dressed in a spa uniform. She's attractive, and she makes very little eye contact. She seems to be very high-strung, uncomfortable in talking with people, and prefers doing little jobs versus interacting. She's nervous, and when she's nervous, she giggles and fidgets. The human or mortal staff know she's a ghost, but they have no ID or identification about her. They know very little about her. But usually the guests are unaware that she's a ghost or an apparition until something goes wrong. And these are some of the encounters. While trying to avoid conversation, she tries to pick up towels or whatever, but her hands and her arms pass right through those things. And when people see that happen, they're shocked, of course. And she's terrified by that. She runs away. She invariably trips over something, falls. She's very upset, starts to cry, and disappears. Another time, she tries to help prepare a room for spa treatment. Her efforts to pick up, move, place objects, such as linens, robes, bottles of oils, and that sort of thing, are fruitless because she can't pick them up because she's an apparition. This greatly frustrates her. And that energy builds up to the point where it's an explosion of emotion. And the room and its contents are scattered everywhere, turning it into an absolute disaster area. It's so messy, the room has to be closed for the day. She apologizes profusely, cries, and then she disappears. One of the human staff says, "It is so weird trying to comfort a ghost." And that's the story of the awkward attendant. Now go on to the next one. This is the Napa Valley Realtors Paranormal Clients. The setting is a St. Helena country estate. Primarily, just couples' voices are heard originally, and it's over the phone. They introduce themselves as the owners of the property. The realtor checks it out and finds that's the case. And they use COVID as the excuse of, over the phone conversations, and also for not being in the same room with her when she does visit the property. The agent hears them moving around and see objects moving, and it's always at night. It's never during the day. The lights are very low, and they have some excuse like eye problems as to why the lights are low. And the house is oddly quiet. They have a successful meeting, and the realtor promises to draw up the paperwork to put the house on the market, the estate on the market. And then she arranges for dropping off that paperwork. And then they have a brief conversation and says, I'll drop these off. And she does. And, when she's there at the house, once again, the couple are in another room, and they say, well, could you just put the paperwork down on the table, and we'll look at it in a few minutes. We're a little busy right now, and we promise we'll contact you. And the realtor says, okay, that's fine. She exits the house, and she runs into the housekeeper. And the housekeeper says, with concern, can I help you? And the realtor says, no, I just dropped off the paperwork for Mr. and Mrs. and the name will be deleted. The housekeeper all of a sudden has a very frightened expression on her face and quickly departs, runs away actually. Days pass and there are no calls from the couple. And so the realtor, the agent, calls them and there are no return calls. Confused and upset, the realtor goes back to the property and there's no answer at the door. And she looks in the window and the interior, which is it was a showcase before when she met with him, was now empty. She stood there quite baffled. She hears someone approaching from behind, turns around, she sees two middle-aged men. Their expressions are of discomfort, as if anticipating a difficult conversation. They introduce themselves to the agent as the sons of the Mr. and Mrs. She asks about the parents and the empty house in great frustration as to what's going on. They sit her down at an outside table and chair, and the sons explain the parents passed away years ago, and the parents had forgotten to take care of one very important legal matter in order for the property to be sold after they passed. So now the property hangs in legal limbo. And their theory is their parents are coming back to try to correct the mess, to carry out their wishes. But once again, it's to no avail because they have passed and there will be no legal standing to their signature on the forms. So that is the story of the Napa Valley Realtors paranormal clients. We're going to go on to the Looking Glass and the Heiress. The setting is Calistoga, and from the earliest memories of this one particular family, there had been no female children born into the family. And it took 5 generations before the first daughter was born to a family member of this longtime Napa Valley, Napa County family. And it was told that generations ago, one grandmother so desperately wanted a daughter and then a granddaughter, she bought a very special family treasure that would go to the first female daughter born into the family. So this girl, and then eventually young woman, was told she would be given this priceless family heirloom, a very rare and special one, when she turned 16 years old. For years, she had visions of an exquisite treasure worth a great fortune. And her 16th birthday arrived. She was so excited. She could barely stand it. And finally, she was going to get her hands on this priceless family heirloom. Impatiently, she opened the gift wrap, carefully opened the box, and then great disappointment fell over her face. It was very obvious. Oh, she said in anger, all this for a stupid handheld mirror, brush and comb set. It's not even sterling, it's just silver plate. She tossed it back in the box, stormed off, pouting. And then she put it in her closet. and it stayed there for a while. However, one evening, months later, there was an odd noise coming from her closet where she had tossed this box. And she looked inside the box, and there was this jingling. And in the mirror, she saw this foggy swirl within that mirror. She was baffled, a little scared, but she went ahead and picked up the mirror. It was her great-grandmother 5 times removed. As a young woman, and her great-grandmother was a young woman in the mirror, she scolded the 16-year-old and said, "How could you be so selfish and unappreciative?" and on, putting the 16-year-old great-granddaughter into her place. And then she proceeded to tell the story to her great-granddaughter. She waited so long to have a daughter in the family. They spent hours talking. Their great-grandma, 5 times removed, advised and gave advice to the 16-year-old. And then the 16-year-old realized just how precious that gift was. Who else could talk across the generation line, across the veil between the 2 worlds, and get great advice and family history and all sorts of wonderful information. And the great-grandmother 5 times told her great-granddaughter 5 times where she could find missing heirlooms such as diaries, journals, unknown photos, accounts of family stories, and all that. And the great-granddaughter was thrilled with this treasure hunt. And then the great-grandmother, 5 times said, "Now you have your great fortune." And that continues today, by the way, 20 years later, for this one young woman. And she now realizes it is truly a family treasure that is priceless, because, as I said earlier, who else can talk across the veil between the worlds? So that is the story of the looking glass and the heiress. Maybe I should say its heiress. Okay, this is another story that's in the Calistoga area. It's the Palmer House. It is a Second Empire style residence that is located in the town of Calistoga itself. It was built in the late 1800s. It is a private residence, so please respect their privacy. History is that it was built for Mr. and Mrs. Augustus Palmer, who was a local judge. And they honeymooned for quite some time, especially in France. And they were so enamored with the new French style of architecture, the Second Empire style with its mansard roof, and also elm trees, that they decided that their home in Calistoga was going to be of that architecture. And also they were going to plant elm trees. It was once called the Elm House, by the way. Sadly, before they could start their own family, Mrs. Palmer passed away from natural causes. And Augustus was so heartbroken that once he finished his commitments, he left Napa County permanently. As far as the hauntings, there are numerous entities that visit this place. Outside, there are 2 to 3 boys that are playing. They're like preteen and teen age. They're partial apparitions. You can see like from the mid-thigh up, the knees up, from the waist up. So you're missing like the legs and feet, that sort of thing. They're running around outside and being kind of stinkers, and they're up to some no good. And then they are all huddled together and kind of whispering, looking around, and then they disperse. They do something. No one really knows what they're doing. And laughing, they run down the street until they fade away. Inside, there are a number of sightings. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer are seen in the house. Augustus is seen sitting and reading the newspaper in the parlor in his favorite chair. And he pays no attention to the mortals that are walking about. And occasionally he gets up, walks around, and smokes a cigar, looks around the house, and then he proceeds to sit down, or he walks through a wall and disappears. Upstairs, Mrs. Palmer is straightening up objects and plumping pillows or fluffing pillows, and just making sure everything is presentable in what is used to be and is a master suite. And she's also dressed in period attire. There's also a maid that is a partial apparition, and she's in a maid's outfit, and she's holding, like carrying stacks of linens or clothing. They're also semi-transparent like she is. And what really clues you in, gives you no doubt that she's a ghost. She has a tendency to walk through walls, and then she reappears downstairs, and then she goes back upstairs, as if she's going about her daily chores. Another ghost is a madam. It is said that that house, the Palmer house, was a brothel at one time. And she would stand at the bottom of the stairs, and she's dressed in 1930s attire, in nicely, nice jewelry and tasteful makeup, that sort of thing. And she would stand there and inspect her girls as they were coming downstairs to meet their guests, if you will, the patrons. And she would make sure that they were dressed appropriately and were presentable and not garish or undesirable in their appearance. So it was an inspection point. Well, unfortunately, one of those evenings when she was getting ready to walk down the stairs, she fell down the stairs. And at the bottom of those stairs, she died. And her ghost, her apparition, full human form, semi-dense in appearance, she is seen at the base of the stairs, anticipating her girls walking down the stairs to inspect them for an evening of work. So that is the stories of the ghosts of the Palmer house. And they happen randomly, by the way, and not all at once. It's not like all of a sudden they all appear the same day. It is very random. Now, I have two more stories. This one is The Long Road Home. The setting is East Napa County. It takes place in the late 1800s. One of the many side roads meandering through Napa County hills is the location. As in those times, and still, neighbors at great distance apart would always band together and gather together to help one another discuss issues, celebrate or observe holidays, and such. On one such auspicious occasion, the neighbors gathered to celebrate the harvest and Halloween of that year. But to everyone's surprise, the old hermit of the hill came to the party. He usually didn't. He was dressed in his Sunday best, and his wagon was full of gifts. He was smiling and laughing, and it was a great departure from his norm, where it was usually surly and rather, shall we say, odoriferous. He had obviously bathed before he put on his Sunday best. One person asked, "What changed? I mean, it's wonderful to see you, but what changed?" And he said, "I realized I've missed out on so much of life's good moments. It's a shame, and I'm ashamed, because you never know when you'll get that call to go back home." And he pointed upward as he made that last remark. All had a great time at that party and were very sad to see it end. The hermit made sure to see each person off with good wishes. Then he reluctantly climbed back into his wagon, wistfully surveyed the scene, waved goodbye to his hosts, and drove off on the long road home. The next morning, a neighbor found the hermit slumped over in his wagon across from his prized vineyard and halfway to his home. At his funeral and wake, his neighbors decided that they were going to have a big party, just like what he had just celebrated and enjoyed not so long ago. So this big party in his honor, remarks were made about the hermit, and how it was so wonderful to see him, and that he had such a good time before he passed. And it's too bad that he hadn't done that sooner. And then they all left the wake. Shortly thereafter, the hermit started making visitations to his neighbors. He was usually, sometimes like it was before, grumpy, but he was a bit kinder than he had been in the past. He would complain about the weather, or he would say, "How are you? Do you need any help?" And as time went along, it was more of, "How are you? Do you need any help?" Or a smile and a wave. And then he would appear and fix or repair a problem, smile and vanish. Or he'd keep watch over his neighbors that he knew were ill or having problems, but he kept his watch at a distance. But he had a knack of materializing just at the right time to minister to his neighbors and help them out however he could. Then he was asked, "Why are you still here?" And the hermit replied, "Because I have yet to finish my work, and I am not fully home from that long road home." That's his words. I know it's an awkward sentence, but obviously he felt, it was his opinion that he had more work to do before he could take that long road home. As it said, he was found halfway home. And that's the story of the hermit of the hill and the long road home. Okay, this is the last story for this particular spooky Napa, and it is Stefan the Sinister Spirit. This also takes place in East Napa County. It's closer to the Berryessa area. And he lived during the Prohibition era. He was in his 20s, during the 20s, if you will. Originally, his job, he was a true teamster. And that's it. He was a driver of wagons that were pulled by teams of horses or mules. And then when the motorized vehicles or trucks became the predominant mode of transportation, he started driving trucks. In the Prohibition era, he became what you might say a booze runner. He helped out a lot of bootleggers get their illegal libations from point A to point B. He was also a narcissist, a misogynist, a player, as they say. He was a predacious alcoholic, and he also was a drug addict. He used morphine, but he was functional. He was also what they call now a serial dater. Stefan would set his sights on a beautiful young woman and go after her until he had his conquest, and then move on to the next. There was one that he was really attracted to. She was a beautiful young woman from an upstanding family that lived close by on a ranch. But she knew his reputation would have nothing to do with him. But he kept working his magic. He charmed and wooed the naive woman. And then, as typical to like Hollywood movies, he got her drunk and had his way with her. The relationship turned abusive, and in disgrace, she retreated to the family ranch. Decades later, Stefan, now middle-aged, eked out a living hauling in odd jobs. A young man convinced him that they were friends and that sort of thing, and convinced Stefan to hire him, and they were getting along just fine. And in the last days for the town of Monticello, before it was completely destroyed to make way for the Monticello Dam and Lake Berryessa, there was a big farewell party at one of the local saloons. And at that point, the young man called out Stefan about the young woman that he had so terribly disgraced, who happened to be the young man's grandmother. And it revealed Stefan for who he was and the fact that he was such a coward. Stefan was stunned and drunk. He stumbled to his truck, drove off, and crashed He should have survived that crash, but for some unknown reason, the truck exploded and he and Stefan died in that fire. Shortly thereafter, a terrible haunting started to occur at the young man's family's ranch. And it was Stefan, a horrible sight to see. He terrorized the females, caused extensive damage to the property, and injuries to the males. Everyone tried to get rid of him. They did everything. It was to no avail. Until Stefan's last victim, now the grandmother. She was frail, but she had great inner strength, returned home, and moved into the ranch house. She summoned all her courage, and she stood up to Stefan, further revealing his cowardice and all of his failings as a human being. She kept on and on and on, and that weakened Stefan to the point where he was barely visible, and what you could see, he was tormented, twisted, and writhing in pain. And the woman said, "You made your choices. It was always someone else's fault. You refused to be accountable." Excuse me, turn page. And she yelled at him, "Coward, coward, coward," with great conviction. Stefan, groaning, vanished for good. Miraculously, the once frail woman, once his victim, regained her health and well-being. She lived many more years, and when she passed in peace. So that is the story of Stefan, the sinister spirit. Any questions or comments?
Wow, who knew there were so many ghosts in Napa?
I know, there were quite a few.
Yeah. Do you have one that's not your favorite, but one that sticks with you the most?
That I told this, right now.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, actually, I like the last story in the fact that there's a moral to the story.
Mm-hmm.
And also the one about the looking glass and its heiress, or the heiress. It also had a moral to the story. I would say those two are my favorites.
Yeah.
Because it has a lot to say. And it gives you pause to think. And also, we are all still living, so we have time to make changes. So
Right. Yeah.
So I have a few more images. I want to thank everyone, including you, Tess, and the library for making this possible. And I hope only good spirits will be with you this haunting season.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to the last frame so that way I can end the share and get back to the main screen. Or screen, maybe that's appropriate. But anyway, I'm going to do the stop share here. And here we go. Back to reality.
I think you're right. Those are more deep and complex and kind of, give more for conversation or discussion about what they mean. I did think that the one with the James Dean fan in the cemetery is very amusing.
Yes, it is. A few people, more than a few people have told me about him, and it is a great story. There are so many others that are from within the cemetery grounds.
Oh.
At some point in time, I'll be telling more of them. But I don't want to overwhelm people. I don't want to scare people off from going to see their, family that are
right.
You said that the Eternal Fan was your favorite. Was there any others that you found interesting?
I found the woman in white at the Waterworks was very moving because it's such a sad story to think that, she's looking for someone that drowned.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty poignant. Yeah.
Well, and then there's some silly ones, or not silly, some amusing ones, and some very sweet ones. I told the story of Boo and Spookly at the library a few years ago about a cat and dog that appear starting about this time of the year and through the holidays at a Napa home. And they're quite a dynamic pair, shall we say, cat and dog. The dog and cat. But they add a lot of life really to the couple and their lives.
Yeah, that would
So
be a sight to see for sure. So how do you usually gather these stories? Are they first person accounts or passed down?
some of them are passed down. Readers sometimes, readers on my column or my article, because I do write an annual article for the Register about local ghost stories, and including this year, no exception. And so people respond. It used to be they would, write a letter or give me a call. Now they just go online and, make comments.
Comment, yeah.
I get more stories that way. For instance, like the creepy caretaker at the
Mhm.
park cemetery. That's where I got a lot of those stories.
Wow.
And then some people, from the moment I started writing Memory Lane, I started writing in July, and by August, I was getting letters from people about their ghostly encounters. And so I started writing columns about their experiences, and which they appreciated. And then it became articles, and then it became the Spooky Napa series, and then I just get more and more stories. And you
That's
know,
interesting.
sometimes it's a case of the research I'm doing for a property.
Mhm.
As I'm researching, uh, the property owner will say, well, part of the reason why we asked you to do research is there's been some strange things that have happened here,
Mm.
and we're needing your help to verify that.
Mm.
So, but they don't tell me initially. Uh,
Yeah,
so, yeah, it's firsthand in the fact that it comes through, via a person that has experienced it. So, uh, anyway,
fascinating.
and occasionally I go and check these things out, and it's just like there have been a couple of times where it's just like, oh, they are telling the truth. There is, the handsome host, or there's the whatever. So
Wow,
yeah,
that's
uh,
crazy.
yeah. I usually go with a few other people, so
I was gonna say, I think I'd be too scared to investigate on my own, any of those.
comfort in numbers.
Yeah, right, always. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much again, Rebecca, for another wonderful Spooky Napa. Hopefully we will have it in person next year as we normally do. And can't wait for that, everyone. Stay tuned for the library's events on our Facebook page and events calendar. And everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Tess. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.